Good evening, everyone. I hope that you're all safe and well and you're keeping yourselves busy while we're all locked and caged up. I hope that none of you have got on the nerves of your other halves, if you have them, and you haven't fallen out and had big arguments. Tonight, we have a Sir in our midst, and all will be revealed later on. Clearly, the Sir doesn't rank higher than Mr. President, so if there's any sort of pulling of rank, then I will be doing that if it's needed. But this chap, when we meet him, he's carried out a fantastic, a very difficult job for our country, and we're looking forward to hearing about that. I'm not talking about his time running the country, I'm about his time being father to Guy McNair-Wilson, but so clearly a much more difficult job than dealing with Thatcher's government, etc., etc.
Okay, so my challenge this evening for Toastmasters is to do a 20-minute Q&A. And rather than talk about myself, which is incredibly boring, I thought I'd invite my father, who's 90 years old, to talk about his experiences as a British politician from 1964 to 1997. So then we'll open up just a few questions from the audience. And I just want to remind you that my father left politics 23 years ago. So this is not meant to be a political grilling. This is just kind of kind and gentle questions if possible. So my father brought us all up beautifully, 5 kids. I know everything about boats, cars, model trains and airplanes, which is something I love with my father as well. One thing I never really quizzed my father about much was his political career. So I'd just like to welcome my father to Hamwic Speakers. Hi Dad, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Impressed by everything I've seen so far. I hope I can keep it entertaining.
Right, I have my first question, which basically, Dad, if you could just give us a couple of minutes summary on the kind of the high points, and your career in a sort of a basic structure, and the things which you feel really represent you.
Yes, most definitely. I really came into politics from the working point of view as a soldier guarding the catafalque for the present Queen's father in Westminster Hall in 1952. 14 years later, I was also in Westminster Hall, but by then the elected representative for the West Lewisham constituency. I've spent most of my working life in politics, and as a result, I've got a fairly clear idea of what makes a successful government. We've had, since 1945, 34 years of Conservative rule, with a certain number of Labour governments as well. But the fact of the matter is that whether one likes it or not, the actual room for change in this country is quite small. Now, before I actually went into the House of Commons, I worked for the steel industry, and I was with the Iron and Steel Federation in Tothill Street. And of course, that's an industry which has been through some very difficult times. I may say a word or two about it later. But one way or another, I spent most of my life as a politician, and I've been very honoured and lucky to represent 2 constituencies, West Lewisham and, as you pointed out earlier, the New Forest.
Okay, thanks, Dad. So this is a public speaking club, as you know. As politics requires a lot of public speaking, what do you reckon your top tips are for sort of becoming an effective public speaker and maybe getting rid of nerves?
Well, I think the first thing you've got to realise is that however big or small your audience is, the fact is you're actually talking one person at a time. And so you needn't be set in any way of a lack of confidence if you only see a very small number in a room. It's always easier to talk to a large audience, but the fact is that the confidence comes with practice, what I might call target practice. The more you speak, the easier it gets, and even to the point of boring all your friends. But the fact of the matter is that a good speaker has to recognize a number of things about his audience. In my constituency of New Forest, it's quite a large retired population, some of whom are quite hard of hearing. So you've got to make sure that you pitch your voice in a way that the hard of hearing people can actually make sense of what's being said. And the other point is this: don't speak too fast. Good, big, long gaps can be very, very theatrically important. But obviously one wants to get the message across, and like all good plays, so a good speech has a beginning, a middle, and an end.
Now I got a message from Mitch and Lisa. Lisa from the USA is listening now. These are family for us. Now Mitch has a question. Are there any parallels between the challenges that COVID-19 presents to the USA today and those that World War II presented to Britain? And what advice would you have for the Americans who are trying to adapt to this sudden shock?
Yes, I think there are parallels. They're not exact ones, but the fact is that in both cases, personal freedom has been put up for questioning. Now, we've heard a certain amount in the newspapers and the radio today about the police force using unnecessary, or what was claimed to be unnecessary, authority and powers to stop people going to where they want to go for a walk in the countryside. And in the wartime, we had another regulation called Defence Regulation 18B, which gave the government and its authority the power to arrest people and have them put aside as aliens without any trial at all. I think we're getting dangerously near that sort of situation in our country. In America, it's going to be more difficult to create that sort of underlying fear, because you're dealing with individual states which have got their own arrangements. And as a federal organization, it wouldn't be quite possible to have the details of 18B or its equivalent in the United States. But yes, I think there are definite parallels.
Okay, thanks. Now, final question from me before we go to the other people. What would you say would be your most highest high and your lowest low in your political career for yourself?
Well, I think the highest high was something which no one will know about, except those real students of politics. I was appointed as chairman of a Lords and Commons Select Committee to rearrange the business of House and Commons. And this was a major job to do. It took 2 years to complete, and it was successful and was accepted. And those young members of Parliament who are sitting there today have me to thank for the fact that they don't have to sit up till 2 in the morning and come home with the milk the following morning in order to get legislation passed. We thinned it out. It works very well. I'm pleased. So far as failure is concerned, well, I let other people judge that. I certainly had a very good time and a great honour to represent 2 constituencies in Parliament. They all had their separate problems, but the very fact that one had been elected to serve was, to me, a very happy moment, and I can't really think of anything I would want to do differently.
Okay, so now I'm going to open up to a few questions I've already been given by members of Hamwic. Richard Blackman. Richard is actually a Liberal politician himself. But yeah, Richard, could you go ahead with yours?
Yeah, thanks, Guy. I think aspiring would probably be a better prefix there. Anyway, good evening. So, Patrick, I wanted to ask you, because you were in Parliament at the time that Britain joined the then European communities. When you look back at that period, do you think that Britain's membership of the European community and then the European Union was only going to be limited in time?
Well, that's a very interesting question, Richard, because it's very relevant to all our political problems at the present time, the genesis of the European Union, before that the common market, was a desire in 1945 to make sure that France and Germany never went to war again. And it has been totally successful. The small nations of Europe have come together, and the big nations have sat round the table with them, and there's no doubt about it, it has helped keep the peace. It also provided a very good trading arrangement. We called it the common market. But that has now grown, of course, into something much bigger, the European Union. And that's where I think the dangers lie. I personally, as a Remainer, I think we should have stayed in the European Union, because I think if you join a club, no club is perfect, at least you have the opportunity to make your voice heard and hopefully get changes made. I think once you leave, your voice becomes a very faint whisper as time goes on. And I don't think there's any doubt about it that the European Union without Britain will mean that Germany becomes by far the most powerful nation in Europe. It is, after all, the biggest economy, the largest population, and the largest area. So, to that extent, I think the idea was good. It achieved its first objective, to keep peace in Europe. It also factory, but I'm sad to say, I think the Brexit concept of Britain leaving and hoping to play an important part in the future has got a big question mark over it.
Okay, thanks, Dad. Thanks, Richard. So, Gillian, now you got a question, please? That's Gillian Myers.
Hi, Patrick. Nice to meet you. Here's my question. What are your opinions on the decline of the steel industry? And was the Scunthorpe closure the right thing to do?
Well, Gillian, you've asked me a question about a subject which I have a little bit of detailed knowledge. I'm really grateful to you for asking that question, because it's central to the way that heavy industry in Britain is going to develop in the future. One's got to realise that the steelworks at Scunthorpe, and there are actually several companies operating there, but what was known as the Anchor Steelworks was built on top of what was an old iron ore company. And you will find that with coal and steel, that both of those industries have tended to be built around finds of the actual raw material. So steel you find in Sheffield, and in the case of Scunthorpe, of course, you find it in Lincolnshire. Now that's the first point. The second point is this: whether one likes it or not, the demand for steel has changed. There was a time when British shipyards were full of ships being built, and the demand for British steel to build them was very considerable. That, I'm afraid, is no longer the case. The huge cruise liners you see now on television and the rest, I'm afraid, have come from other countries. That's the second point. And the third point is this: at the moment, there is no sign of a great increase in steel demand by British steel companies. And this is a tragedy, because we've got the HS2 railway line being built. I would like to think that all the rails are made in UK steel mills. I don't know that that's going to happen or not. I think the temptation to buy the cheapest from the Far East has undermined in a very large way the position, the commercial position of steel. But I think, unfortunately, that in the circumstances, the fact is one has to accept that the Scunthorpe closure was probably inevitable. Lack of demand, cheap imports, and quite frankly, in the wrong place.
Okay, Andrew, our president of Hamwic, you got a question, Andrew?
Yeah, good evening, Sir Patrick, and thank you for coming to Hamwic. This is a real treat and an honour for us here to have you with us. So thank you for coming along. You obviously are.
Thank you.
We're in Parliament pre David Cameron. I'll assume. So I'll ask a question going back a few years. You would have been in Parliament then when Enoch Powell gave his famous Rivers of Blood speech, which in itself is an incredible piece of oratory, whether you agree or disagree with what he said. Noted that you were an MP for Lewisham, and I just wanted to have your take on how your constituents reacted to that speech when it came at the time, and what it was like to listen to that being delivered.
Well, it's a very interesting question, that one, Andrew. I knew Enoch quite well. He was a very much a loner. He wasn't really a public figure in the way that most public figures are portrayed. But the fact is that he did hold certain views very, very strongly. Now, you're absolutely correct. Part of West Lewisham, which was the constituency I represented, was a part called Brockley. Now, Brockley was one of the areas to which immigrants in the 60s were encouraged to go. And one must also remember that Enoch Powell himself encouraged immigration. I know he spoke about Rivers of Blood, but when he was Minister of Health, he did all he could to encourage people from the Caribbean and elsewhere to come and work in England. And I think his speech, though I've no doubt honestly meant, was a very unfortunate choice of words, because the fact is that you couldn't run the public services of this country without immigrants. And he was quite wrong in believing that it was going to lead to great bloodshed. Yes, it'll take time for everybody to settle down, but the fact of the matter is, you need the immigrants if you want to have a country with the services that we enjoy.
Now, if we could go to Kevin Braithwaite, please. Kevin, are you there, Kevin?
Yeah, I'm here. So, thank you very much for joining us. Quite interesting being a man from Scunthorpe listening to that previous speech. That was interesting. So my question to you was, when you were working with the energy sector, did the government have a vision of non-fossil fuel-based energy in the future?
I think the short answer is no. But I think because industries and politicians also tend to be rather opportunistic in their approach to things, in the days back in the 1960s and 70s, Britain had a four-fuel economy: coal, oil, nuclear, and of course wind power. Now, the fact is that the nuclear answer is probably the right answer. I know we hear a lot about electric cars and what's coming in the future. People fail to explain where the electricity to drive all these things, to charge these batteries, is coming from. And I personally believe that with the end of the fossil fuel scheme of coal and oil, we're going to have to start thinking very seriously about the nuclear industry as its ability to carry the base load of the generating system. You won't carry the base load of demand with solar panels. You may do something quite substantial with windmills, but none of it is in any way the same sort of quantity expansion that you will get from a nuclear power station. And nuclear power in Britain has in fact had a very good record since it first came on stream. And we've got the possibility now that with outside help, new power stations are going to be built at Hinkley Point in Somerset. But I think one's also got to remember that nuclear power is clean. It doesn't have any smoke coming out of chimneys. So the environmentalists shouldn't worry too much. I know they're concerned about spent fuel rods and where you're going to put the waste. But the fact is that there are solutions to this, fenestration and burying it and the rest. But I really genuinely believe that what we need is a thriving nuclear industry. You won't need very many stations, and indeed you could build much smaller stations and have it more adaptable to local requirements. And so to that extent, I'm a nuclear supporter, but I realize that there is quite a huge gap in people's understanding. And at the moment, the government has to tread carefully, but I hope we won't reject nuclear because it, I believe, is the answer.
Just quickly, just on national service, we had a debate here at Hamwic Speakers a few months ago. And Stuart, would you mind just asking that question? Stuart Shaw?
I just want to, you mentioned early on that you were a soldier early in your career. Just wanted to know from your experience what your thoughts would be as to whether the UK would be better or worse if we were to adopt national service.
Well, like many of my age group, I did my national service, which was 2.5 years. And, it was part of life in those days and it worked quite well. Afterwards, in fact, it worked so well that I decided that I wanted to be a regular soldier, and I took the necessary exams, and in the end did 6 years in the military. Now, I do not believe that you could introduce national service today and get the same degree of acceptance that existed in the 40s and 50s. People are different. They don't want to sit there peeling potatoes in a camp in Yorkshire. And some of the difficult jobs that the soldiers and others have to do these days would make recruiting, I think, really quite difficult. So the answer is it worked well. There were plenty of jokes about it, we know that. You only got to watch Dad's Army to work that one out. But the fact is, it's a different country. There are different views. There are indeed different people in command. I don't think you could really reintroduce national service and expect it to be a success.
Final question, very briefly, please. Yasin, would you mind just closing us on a question, please? Yasin George.
Hello, Sir Patrick. Hi, it's wonderful to have you with us tonight. My question is, how does politics compare now to when you were involved? Has it changed for the better?
Well, it's certainly changed. Of that, there's no doubt. And some people will always argue that all change is good. Parliament today is very different because the people are different. Most of the senior positions in the government of whatever colour, whether it was Labour or Conservative or whatever, had experience of the war and had served. Jim Callaghan was in the Royal Navy, Tony Wedgwood Benn was a fighter pilot, and then you had other distinguished politicians on the Conservative benches with considerable experience and medals to prove it and all the rest of it. So it's a different cast of that particular play. And I think one has to accept that although it may in a way have a jarring note attached to it, people realize that Britain has changed. It's a freer and I would say a fairer society today. Not perfect, and it never will be perfect, and we don't want it to be perfect because there'll be nothing to change. But the fact is that the politicians of today represent a different strata of the world, and they're people who have to go out and earn a living. They're more in touch with their constituents. So on balance, I would say it's good, and it will probably get better.
Thanks, Dad. Thank you so much for coming. I'm deeply proud. And
Great pleasure. Thoroughly enjoyed it.
yeah, okay. And thank you. I'm sure we're all as grateful as I am. Now you can see what I do every Tuesday when I go to my Toastmasters. And I'm going to hand back now to Pasha, and I'll speak to you again later, Dad. See ya.
Guy, that was absolutely incredible. I could have stayed all night talking to your dad and asking him questions. Someone that's 90, being so with it and on the ball and being able to respond to the questions we asked him. And your bit there, you got emotional. You said you were proud of him and everything, but I think your dad, he's not here now, but he would be really proud of you. We all know where you were when you first started this club, and you've come a long way. Your speech making is fantastic. What you bring to the club is fantastic. Such diversity in the program and the delivery and the content of your speeches. I could go on all night talking about it, but it's a shame your dad's not here to sort of say, we're all proud of you for what you've achieved. So well done, Guy. That was really, really good. So well done. I liked your dad's comment. No club is perfect. Well, he hasn't been to Hamwic very much, then, has he? Because I'm going to argue that point with him. But what he did say is, and the point to take away is, if you leave a club, then you can't have a say about changing it. So well done to everybody that renewed on time, because you can have your say in it. And I'll come into how you might have your say on the club in future, shortly in another part of this. I'm going to apologise for Jill. She didn't refer to him as Sir. He's Sir Jill. You must refer to him as Jill. Not Jill, as Sir. So please next time refer to him as Sir. He called me Mr. President, which is what he should have done, and I won't be picking him up on that later. Pasha, I really like the opinions from older people. Get opinions from people older than you. That's practically everybody in this room. So please ask any of us for opinions about anything. So because you're only about 12, aren't you, I think?